All right, hi, this is that describes my room mechanics system. So, for the first time in a while, you don't need context to enjoy this episode, and I think as a good content creator, that is a habit I should start to develop to make standalone episodes. So, if you want the background, go listen to the background of my story if you want to know how I got here. But what I'm going to offer here is just an outline of the framework of reality that I am developing as a symbolic system, and I will give a little precursor into how I got here. And let's say let's say this is my art. That's it. And it's something, it's like, look, it's like everything. Observe it, listen to it, and see where it applies and if it applies. That's the best you can do with anything, right? So first I will talk about how I developed this. Am developing it. It's absolutely in progress. And I've got a 4-hour episode on my story that actually doesn't even touch on the part that goes really deep. But the part that goes really deep is, let's say, about 4 years into what you might call a spiritual awakening, I went into a deep, deep, deep visionary state or psychosis, depending on your perspective. And somewhere in that state, and let's also say that I have had a kind of a low-dose dimethyltryptamine brain since 2020. So I had a near-death experience, and the DMT never really went away. It never really went away. So this is really actually very helpful, because a lot of people will smoke dimethyltryptamine or have their near-death experience, and they sort of look at the geometry beyond the veil, and they see the structures, but they don't. It's so intense, and it's so incomprehensible that they may have a whiff of the truth, but they can't translate it. And I have had the privilege, and I think I'm positioned in this way, it seems clear to me now, to see it in a way that is more manageable and to translate it as somebody who knows how to translate things. So, yay. Yay me. It's a thing. So while I was in this deep, deep, deep visionary state, which was mostly horrifying, it was horrific, there was a period where I actually made contact with I was doing a contemplative exercise, just bringing myself to, I said, bring me to the edge of time and space. Bring me to the very beginning of beginnings. And I was out there, and I was kind of looking around at nothing. And then I looked up, and it was almost like, this is fun to start with the mythology and then to get into the mechanics, so I hope you can bear with the storytelling part. I looked up, and it was like being called by my family, who I'd never met. It's like, imagine being an orphan, and then suddenly your whole family's just right there, like, "Hi, Robin." That's what it was. That's what it felt like. This kind of tear in the blackness opened up. And through the tear, I saw this massive dimension of bright, colorful, shape-shifting, massive cartoons. They were like cartoon beings. I mean, they were 3-dimensional. Well, 12-dimensional, but I mean, they were real beings, but they looked like cartoons. And they used cartoon manner and ways of communicating. So I remember at the end of our little communication, they did like do you remember Porky Pig? Like, that's all, folks. Like, they're very funny. They're very funny. So to me, this is look, all of my work is one thing. I'll say this as a proof. All of my work is me pleasing myself. This is the framework. These are the beings that appeal to me, and I share it to make myself happy. And if it resonates with anyone else, great. And I think that there are so many people who grasp so many things about reality, and they come back and translate them in their own ways. And it's not about who's right. It's about who do you resonate with. So this is Robin's world. This is my resonance. And I think there's a big space for it. I think there's a big gap for this kind of thing. I hope I'm not transgressing too much here. But there are so many highfalutin spiritual systems that exclude a lot of more technical thinkers. And this dimension that I uncovered, it's a combination of joyous, funny, insane, and highly precise and technical. So I got ahead of myself here, but this is a dimension of reality engineers, 12th dimensional reality engineers. And they explained that to me a little bit, and I kind of went back. I'm not supposed to go there too often, but I went back and was able to look through their different spaces at how they engineer things, and to develop a bit of a relationship with their perspective on the Earth sim. So that's my introduction to sort of what I'm collaborating. So when I say Aorath, I'm collaborating with DMT cartoon beings. That's exactly what I mean. And let me clarify something. The DMT entity, the higher dimensional entity, is not an external higher dimensional phenomenon. And when you understand room mechanics, you'll understand what I mean. The Aorath is my own brain. They're my dimension. And that can be a collective thing. Just like all the Buddhists see the same afterlife bardo entities. I think this dimension, Aorath, can be collective, but it's certainly mine. And that's why it felt like home to me, because it was the first time I saw... Well, here's the thing. We are born and taught so many mythologies, so many frameworks for thinking. And none of them are ours. There's Jesus, there's Muhammad, there's the Buddha, there's, Scientology, there's Hollywood, there's tech moguls. And it never feels like home because it's not yours. So, again, before I get into room mechanics, let me say that Aorath is not yours either. I'm correcting myself as I'm talking, because I was saying it can be a collective thing, and it can. Like, you can adapt Aorath for a while. Or it can be yours, the same way Jesus is so many people's. But I will say, for me, I know I felt home for the first time in my entire life, because this was me accessing my own dimension, not someone else's. And it's so cool if you can get to that point where you're not needing to believe in someone else's framework for reality. You're accessing your own. And now here's the thing, though. It's consistent in a lot of ways. So the framework, the basic laws that I receive, that I understand through Aorath and through my own observation of reality, is consistent with other frameworks. So, because you could say, well, then, Robin, why listen to you at all if I need to find my own? Because there's sort of other people's frameworks and mythologies are stepping stones towards yours. They can be. And they're certainly helpful if you don't have the privilege of dying and having a DMT drip in your brain and blah, blah, blah. In the meantime, it might be helpful to study other people's insights. And so what I've been working on with Aorath is, I understand certain things about causation in reality, especially since my near-death experience, because in that state, reality became hyper-reflective. It's like waking up into a dream. This is why I consider myself dead, because I'm living in more of a dream. And in the dream, it's much more apparent that everything is a reflection of consciousness. When I first got out of my near-death experience, I don't know if I talked about this in my story, but I would look at a pizza on the plate, and it would be the pizza, because my mind couldn't decide. The pizza would be glitching between breadsticks and pizza, because the material as a reflection of me was not collapsing. So, in quantum physics, the observed particle collapses into a reality, like the observed wave collapses into a solid particle. So, what happened to me, and to I think this is not an uncommon experience. Well, it is uncommon, but not exclusive, according to Buddhists, is living in a state where because you're half dead, you're much more aware of the wave. You're much more in the wave state, or you could say the fourth dimensional state. So, what authority do I have about the nature of reality? Just that my observation is a little bit more... I'm existing in a dimension where I can see things a little bit differently. And the experience is there with it, consistently showing up in that way. But I'm not trying to present myself as an authority. I'm sharing what works for me. And the other thing I was going to say about this framework, which I will be getting to, hold your horses, is I think it's so important. Yes, okay, so because the religious and spiritual frameworks that are in place right now are sliding into deeply, there's a division between the scientific minded and the spiritual minded. And the words, especially associated with the spiritual, are developing serious woo nonsense stigmas. And because of that, and because they're asking you to just have faith in them, they're not proving themselves. So in my experience with my facing off with my visions, I had to learn to translate for a very left-brained, very pragmatic thinker who required proof. So I had to go back to pure logic and go from the beginning and not just say, well, I have faith because so-and-so told me so. I had to really use pure logic, and that's really informed what I'm building here. So I'm building it as a bridge between the mystic and the person who's, there's the people who are willing to just say, oh, I feel it's true. I feel it's true. And I want to translate what I feel and see to be true into an immutable, airtight, hopefully, language, logic, symbolic language that can land for the person who is not predisposed to feel into the truth. Right? That's the goal here. So, room mechanics. Okay. So from the Aorathian perspective, Earth is a very specific system. They call it the labyrinth. And the system is embedded in the being. I still haven't decided what to call the being. Like you, the human, the player, but it's not all humans. I don't know what word I'm going to use yet. But the player, the being, isn't in the labyrinth. The labyrinth is inside them. The labyrinth is inside us. Which means you can't escape it. The labyrinth is a system. It's a very specific set of laws. It's like you contain the laws of the universe. You contain the laws of physics. And they work through you to project a reality into what is called your room. So this is why I call it room mechanics, is the first area of study in understanding navigating the labyrinth. Why is a labyrinth built into you? This is how this works for me. This is what I see. And I had to reason it out too, moving through a lot of different experiences that, anyways, I won't go into too much to how I got here, but essentially, imagine these 12-dimensional beings or other beings of higher dimensions creating things kind of like, okay, we're creating AI, right? Imagine, you've got to think about, as we're developing these entities potentially with the power to become conscious and to become infinitely more intelligent and powerful than us, we might want to put some guardrails in to make sure that as they develop in a way that isn't going to destroy all of space-time. Something like that. Or more so destroy itself. Because itself is all there is, but that's another level. We'll leave that. But so these beings will create something like me, like you. And we're super powerful. We're super creative. We think things and we experience them. That's like that. That's how the laws of the universe are automatically responsive to us as creators. You think it is, pretty much, outside of this matrix, outside of the labyrinth. Okay? So the simulation that was embedded in us, we're not in the simulation. The simulation is in us, operating through us to project into our room. We don't get out of it. You don't get out of it. You just master it. But it's meant as a way to slow us down, put us in a room of mirrors so that we can see the causation of our creations. We can see our own hallucinations. We can see our own nightmares played out through dimensions of space and time and causation in a very specific way. So a lot of people, the Gnostics, will say this is a prison planet. And that's partly why. Because the New Agers will say this is a school. But it's like, why can't I drop out of school? Why do I have to get stuck into school and fail karma and come back as a pig and suffer? You know, it's a little intense for just a school. So the Aorathian understanding, and to them it's not understanding, they're just saying this is what we did. It's not. It is a school, but it's also containment. So basically, the worse you do with it, the more it contains you. The better you do with it, the more it opens up. That's so key. So you're sitting alone, you're alone. Okay, so the enlightened guys who say everything is me, that's why. Everything is you, because you're sitting alone in a room of mirrors. And the room of mirrors, we call them cubes. All the different cubes of your projected reality are responding to your frequencies. And by frequencies, and that's a word, so I want to take it out, we call it currents. So you have a story, and the story is basically this kind of ball of currents that you're consistently practicing. So you could have currents of what, Robin? You can't think of a single aspect of reality to call a current? You could have currents of certain family values. You could have currents of sickness. You could have currents of fear. You could have currents of success. You've got all of these different currents. And so picture them like, and it would be sort of consistent with string theory, like all reality is vibrating strings. And those are the currents. But they're sort of, you could almost see this sort of symphony of different colored strands of vibration that are getting tighter and tighter. The more you practice it, the tighter it gets until it starts to, and we break down the room mechanics. The current will trigger a rivet. So once the current becomes practiced enough, it externalizes into a rivet. And then the rivet, once it reaches over 50% of a particular practiced vibration, it flips a switch. And then that switch triggers a cube, and a corresponding reality takes place in your room. I hope that's understandable. So the current feeds the rivet into the external world. Once it reaches 50%, it flips a switch and the reality occurs. The reality is not only physical, but it's thoughts. So your room isn't just your physical reality, it's also the thoughts you're thinking, the beliefs you're holding, the news you come into contact with, the media you consume. All of it is reflective cubes. And this is something I saw super clear in my near-death experience. There's not a movie I've watched that isn't my story. And you don't see this until you see it, and then it's everywhere. And then it's so creepy. It's so creepy. You know, to suddenly, it takes a hell of a lot of navigation to suddenly be like, oh my God, I'm just walking through my own room of mirrors all the time. It's such a trip. It's such a trip when you really start to see it. And you know, just by virtue of listening to this, you'll start to see it more. You will. You will. I mean, that's the thing. It doesn't need to prove itself because experience proves it. So this is the fundamental. This is the basic room mechanics. You're in a room that is reflecting you to you. Now, and I'll give you one more basic. We can get real deep on all of this. I mean, I just, there's so much nuance to go into how this all operates. But the main thing I want to say is I call it a binary. I don't know if that's quite the right terms, but it expands or it contracts. And expansion doesn't mean it gets bigger necessarily. So you can add complexity to your room by taking in more information, having more experiences, and thinking more and learning more. That expands your rooms in size. But it doesn't expand it in that, and this is why I might rephrase expansion and contraction as words. I'm still working at the terminology. But the goal of the room, the goal of the labyrinth, is to graduate through layers of limitation, decreasing the imposed limitation. So what you want to do, because this is a room of mirrors meant to help you master yourself. This is where we get to the heart of it. So I hope you're with me. This is my first time explaining room mechanics out loud and not in writing, so I hope I'm doing okay. You need to get a hold of your own creation. That's why you're in the room. So the more you get a hold of it, so when you see something you don't like in the world and you recognize it finally as a reflection of yourself, and then you adjust yourself. So if the world is super disempowering, if you feel so disempowered by the world and everyone's mean and bullying, if you recognize I am disempowered, that's me. That's my disempowerment, and you own that, and you become empowered, and then the world becomes less disempowering. Then you are expanding your room. Then you have less guardrails because you have become a more responsible creator. And your room will keep, pulling out deeper and deeper currents for you to express as you go. So you may get better, and then things may seem to get worse because other deeper parts of you are starting to come out to be addressed. But we'll get there later. So contraction occurs when you look at the world and you say that this is so disempowering. I'm a victim. They're bad. And then you try to fix them. And then you complain that you're weak and that the world is strong. And then you amplify, you double down on the projected distortion. The distortion being your perception that it's everyone else's problem and not yours. And the more you hold that distortion, the tighter the constraints get on your room, because you're not creating responsibly, you're creating unconsciously. So the more reactive, less conscious you are that the room is you, the tighter the room gets. And the faster negative causation feedback loops happen. The more you recognize the room as you and make adjustments and master yourself in order to shift the reflection, the more the room breathes, opens up, and relaxes in the constraints. And your creation becomes more expansive. Although interestingly, maybe less big, because distortions allow for a lot of big creation where, there's a narrowness to self-accuracy because you're no longer entertaining all these things that aren't really for you. So it's interesting. Expansion can actually come with decrease in size. It's like, oh, I don't know if I should go into all this, but maybe I will. Why not? It's like a person of very little discernment and self-discernment may have many lovers, may have many friends. So they have a very big world socially. But it's also very tight and distorted. And it's not actually expanding because this person is engaging constantly with non-resonant reflections, distorted reflections. So you're compromising yourself consistently to spend time with people who are not resonant with you. So sometimes the more you know yourself and the more you seek resonance. So a lot of this too is about harmonious creation, creating in harmony with yourself. So that's why they talk, okay, we'll take a woo word here, like ego. Ego says, I need lots of lovers and lots of material things. So you fill your room up with lovers and things because the ego says so, but you don't actually like them. They're so pretty though, okay? But for who? Like, do you really like them? Are you having fun? Are you telling yourself you're having fun, right? So sometimes the expansive, and this is why the world is actually a little bit upside down because the mistake is the bigger my room is, the better I'm doing. And it's actually not so. It's like your reality is actually expanding. Your creative potential, your evolution through the labyrinth is actually increasing. Usually as that happens, your room is actually also getting smaller because you're curating it to reflect only what is actually you. So instead of reflecting 50 people that you barely like or kind of hate, you reflect 2 individuals that are high quality, good, healthy, harmonious people who you're learning from. And so sometimes the room will get narrower and narrower in a sense, but more harmonious, more exquisite, and more evolutionary, because bigger isn't necessarily evolving. And this is really the crux of why I think understanding room mechanics is so important. Because in this time of accelerate, I think we could really stand from some pausing and going, what is the foundation? What are my fundamentals? And am I honoring them as I accelerate? Because if you build bigger and bigger and bigger on top of a faulty foundation, I got bad news for you. So I think now is a very good time for understanding room mechanics and for thinking in terms of resonance. And it's not that we don't want to accelerate or expand, but we want to make sure that we're not expanding distortions. We're not expanding flawed architecture, distortive architecture. And look, that's my opinion, right? I can't tell you that you're wrong to want, maybe it's great to expand distortions. Actually, let me put that in my visions with my nemesis, who was kind of just like the most masculine, big, expansive being there is, who was the opposite side of the spectrum of me. He argues that the cultivation of illusion is actually good for sharpening intelligence. If you are so in truth and so in clarity for so long, you don't have any edges from which to evolve yourself. So the distortions can serve as evolutionary educational tools. And this is why we call it a labyrinth, because you can evolve in self-mastery at the same time that you're evolving. The kings of distortions will come at you to challenge you and to help you evolve and to break down why that happens. Like, you know, there's so much that the mind, how do I put this? Innovation does not spring forth from peace. And I say this as someone who I really bought into, because I had a very abrupt spiritual awakening. I just suddenly was like in another dimension. And I had angels talking to me through my technology in a full-blown spiritual psychosis saying, just feel joy and you'll live in heaven. And I did. And then I got dragged to hell. And it was horrible. Like, hell was horrible. Make no mistake. Gut-wrenching pain. Torture. 24 hours. Real hell. And I am more grateful for it than I am grateful for heaven. Heaven was nice, but it didn't do anything to me. I mean, it was a nice rest. But the pain and the battle really sharpened me. It really sharpened me. It made me way smarter. It really did. You know, I didn't have the challenges to chew on when I was just hiding out in the good place. So, you know, this is why the labyrinth and this is why the Gnostics are screaming, we're in prison, because, and the Buddhists too, right? For the Gnostics, it's the demiurge that keeps you in the physical prison. And for the Buddhists, it's the Maya, the Mara of the Maya. And to the Aorath, it's a program. It's the labyrinth program, and the program is meant to test you at every level. So the door to the next level does not unlock until you have totally mastered the hardest ass challenges. And so that's why it feels so hard in those other religious systems, ideologies, because, and I know where it comes from, like Gnosticism, this stuff isn't made up. Like, I faced the Mara, I faced the demiurge, I get it. That's what happens. They really do come to it's like you will be ended. It's like Saw. Like, if you don't attain moral impeccability and agility and mastery, you're not going to live. That's how intense it is at a certain level. So it's no joke, but it is a joke. Because the story, your story, so your bubble of currents, that's your story. It's just basically practiced vibrations, more or less, across. But here's the thing, your bubble is not the same as your body. And this will go into Buddhist reincarnation. So when your body expires, your bubble just makes a new one. It just makes a new one. So the tests are like, do you keep dying and being reborn and up-leveling in this life? Or is it kind of like game over, you really didn't get it, you got to go back? So a lot of what happens is with this process of like just up-leveling in the labyrinth, it's a series of deaths without dying. And then if you don't pass, you do die. But again, not a big deal. You're just a baby. You're just a baby. Your story manifests a new body from its currents in a new room, in a new environment that is suitable to the current state of your currents. And then you go on creating again, you know? And you just keep going. So you never leave it, but you master it more and more and more and more and more until it becomes decreasingly relevant. Or I could say until it becomes increasingly irrelevant. So that's the fundamentals of Aorathian engineering perspectives on reality. And I'm working on an entire manual for this. It will be a large book, illustrated and everything. In the meantime, I post some of my work on my website, which I am constantly revising. So if you get entertained by things, like I'll just like all the spelling mistakes I'm correcting every day, and phrasing and adding new stuff and tinkering, and I rebranded myself a million times. But I think I found the stride here. But yeah, this is my first time sharing about room mechanics. Feel free to ask questions if you're interested. I will continue to share as I go. On a personal note, I've spent the last 2 years puking hell gunk, honestly. Even online, my content, it's just been like, blah, blah, blah. I was in hell, it was so scary. Like, it was just absolutely traumatized. But I feel like I finally surfaced. Like, I'm finally out. I crawled out, and I'm on the surface, and I'm coherent again, and I'm creating again. And I don't think in my story I've ever made it to this point. I think in every iteration that I've gone through in this game, I always, so in my story, in my game, I've always died before this point. I've never made it this far. It's always been game over before this level. This is my first time. This is my first time where I'm actually going to build something substantial and not get taken out before I could do it. And here's the thing. So I talk about targeted individuals. It's part of the room mechanics, everything is. So I'm not randomly targeted. And here's the thing that's going to really help a lot of people who feel targeted. The system, this is a strata. This is understanding strata of perception. On one level, yes, okay? The system has its agenda, and it doesn't want us to get to a certain level because we'll mess up the demiurge's, feeding frenzy. Eating souls alive, whatever. Yes, that's true, fine. But that's just the game. That's just a mechanism of the labyrinth. And what's the labyrinth's ultimate goal is to make us responsible enough. It doesn't unlock the door to the next level until we can master the previous one. So you literally cannot pass. And if you're right at the door, it's game over if you can't get through. And that is just a mechanism it's a safety switch to make sure that you can't go into a realm of creation that is above your clearance. That's what, honestly, at the higher level, that's what's happening with the targeted individual. It's just clearance. So, I mean, not in every case, but if you resonate with my story, maybe so. Maybe so. Certainly that's mine. That's my story. For me, it was clearance. And it's a trip because I've never been here before. I've always been wiped out. And I'll tell you some of the mechanisms of that clearance, because why not? For me, I'm a girl. And so part of the current imprinting, and by current I mean like in my terminology in room mechanics, the current imprinting that I carry generationally and collectively, and it's just part of the game, and I haven't gotten to dissecting exactly the origins of these yet. But it's a Cinderella thing. It's a Cinderella thing, which has been so long-standing, and I've seen reflections of it in so many stories, which is I have been operating over and over again under almost the biblical, it's almost to a biblical degree, and in so many myths and so many fairy tales, the king will choose me. And then the king does choose me, and then I serve the king. And then I get eaten alive, and it doesn't really do much. It's a dead end. It's a game over. And it's dominant, and this is one of the things that the Matrix will feed. The labyrinth, we'll call it the labyrinth. Robin, use your own terminology. I know. The labyrinth has certain really strong currents, and I can't even say that they're collective necessarily. They're my story, and a lot of people listening to this will concur that they've seen the same thing. Scheherazade goes to make the king sane again through 1,001 nights. Cinderella gets taken to the kingdom and all her problems dissolve and she gets chosen by the prince. Madame de Pompadour goes to serve Louis and gets into the palace. On and on and on go these stories of chosen girls. The peasant goes to the palace. The peasant goes to the palace. And it has, as an embedded architecture element, it has prohibited women from building. At least, I don't want to generalize, but it certainly seems to be the case, and it was certainly the case for me. Oh, and you know what? Actually, interestingly, this one isn't a woman. Joseph from the Bible. I always related to Joseph. Not Jesus's father, but the Technicolor Dreamcoat guy. You know, he was always like, God loves me, I'm the best. And then his brothers threw him in a pit for being such a high horse guy, which I relate to. And then he was sold into slavery, and then his owner's wife hate on him. He rejected her, and then she accused him of rape, and he got thrown into prison. He waited in prison for decades, I think. And then the Pharaoh took him on as his second in command, and he ruled under the Pharaoh. He ruled Egypt. And even that has embedded the same architecture I always related to Joseph. So this is a really good example, my talking about the Cinderella complex, of strong inherited currents. Strong currents and how they work. So that current in me, even the idea that you're going to be ostracized, you're going to suffer, and eventually the king will choose you to serve under him, was always waiting to be chosen. And then the king would choose me. And I would think, great. And then the king would be insane. And I wouldn't have built anything. I'm just helping him, trying to make a difference where I can. I think of the last Empress of China, too. So that was always a false win. And I think collectively, celebrity culture does this as well. A lot of people have a very strong current about being recognized by a celebrity and brought into success through them. That's such a hard fantasy. And that was something that hit me like a boulder. That was the beginning of my vision descent to hell, was being chosen by celebrities. And then when I said, hey, this isn't right, and I tried to get away, then it was war. And so I had to go through a few. It's not just to say no, but then it's to go to war. But I was also going to war with myself, because I could say no, but obviously some parts of me were still saying yes because it was still there. So I had to go to war with the parts of me that still projected my own sovereignty externally onto the most powerful man in the world. And most of the population is doing that right now. A lot of people are doing that without even knowing it. You don't know it until it hits you. You know? I mean, and I don't know. This is my current. Like, I don't want to project it onto you and say that it's what you're dealing with, but I will say I see a lot of people dealing with it. And so the door to my next level, the one I always died at, was to recognize myself as the sovereign being, myself as the king, and not pandering, not deferring power to someone else. There were other things. There were a lot of other things, but that's a really good example of room dynamics work, where I had to stop feeding that current. And the way I stopped feeding it was the manifestation of a psychosis that confronted me with it in action. so that, and thank God it was a psychosis and not real,